Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalan Johnson. My guest today is Julie Menanno. Julie is a trailblazing therapist, author, educator, a masterful interpreter of attachment theory, and an architect of emotional connection who is continually working to bridge the gap between complex psychological concepts and everyday struggles. As a revolutionary force in the world of relationships, Julie's work has transformed the way we understand emotional intimacy and human connection. Julie is the creator of The Secure Relationship, a platform that has reached millions worldwide with a mission to dismantle the barriers that keep people from experiencing the joy of deeply connected, secure relationships. Julie's groundbreaking work reveals the hidden patterns that drive emotional disconnection, that undermine love, and empower people to break free from cycles of fear, misunderstanding, and insecurity. Julie's approach is not just therapeutic, but transformational, offering practical tools for fostering trust, vulnerability, and emotional safety, foundations upon which healthy relationships thrive. Fueled by her own journey of personal growth and self-discovery, Julie infuses her work with compassion and authenticity, and she draws on her lived experiences to connect with her audience, making her teachings profoundly relatable and universally impactful. Through her widely followed social media presence, best-selling book, and sought-after workshops, Julie has become a beacon of hope for those seeking to heal past wounds, nurture self-awareness, and cultivate lasting bonds. In a world increasingly disconnected by technology and societal pressures, Julie stands as a guiding light, reminding us that love and connection are not just desires, but essential human needs. And with every conversation, every session, and every word, Julie transforms lives one secure relationship at a time. So, Julie, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
You're so welcome, and thank you for that just amazing, beautiful, lovely, lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to that.
Well, I did give a brief
Yeah.
introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and how and where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I do a type of therapy called emotion focused therapy for couples, which is based on attachment theory, which we can, dive into a little more later. And I got to this place because I have been married for almost 25 years now. I can't believe that. And I have 6 children, and I did not grow up in a emotionally healthy home. But I always valued connection in relationships. I knew from a very young age that I wanted a big family, not necessarily 6 kids. That was a little bit of a surprise because we had surprise twins and then a surprise at the end there. But so I would have these like I had this, like, some people have imaginary friends when they're kids. I had an imaginary whole family. Like, it was this whole imaginary family. I wasn't a part of the family, but I had this like beautiful, system built around them and their lives. And I remember I would go in my backyard and I had one of those pink rubber balls, and I would throw it up on the roof of my house and catch it for hours. I mean, for hours I would go out there and do that. And while I was throwing the ball, the whole time I was just creating these stories around this imaginary family. So I think there was just something in me from a very young age that was really had a strong drive toward relationships. And I married young. I was 23 when my husband and I got married. And well, bam, I get this beautiful family, and I had no idea what to do. None. I mean, I did not know how it was more with my kids than my husband. I didn't know emotional availability whatsoever. I knew I wanted it. I knew I wanted to give it, but I didn't know how. I was just really struggling with parenting, like finding a balance between, healthy boundaries and emotional availability. And I was reading every parenting book out there and nothing was helping me at the time. There wasn't a lot out that had, was helping you parent from an attachment perspective. And eventually I stumbled across some parenting styles that were more attachment based, and that really helped. But ultimately, I thought, I've read everything out there. I need to just go learn, psychology for myself. I need to somehow figure out how humans are working with this stuff. And again, it was really more centered around parenting. Um, and so I got into grad school, and I just, they weren't teaching attachment theory at the time, but I found it on my own, and I just immersed myself in it. Um, and then I had, the irony is I really didn't want to work with couples or families. I had zero interest. I really just wanted to work with individuals, adult individuals, um, and use the information to help my kids at home. Right. Um, and then, so I had to get your license, in to be a therapist. You have to see couples. You have to see some couples. Like, you have to have a certain number of hours just so you're exposed to it. And so I had this first session, and I was like, you know, this is incredibly hard. This is really hard. Like, you're not dealing with one person where, if you need to, you can kind of skate along, or the pressure's not too high. You've got two people in here, and you've got, they're not just the two people, but all the relationships from their past in the wound, all the different parts of
Mhm.
themselves in the room, and their relationship between each other. And I thought, well, I've got to figure out how to do this. Like, I can't not know how to do this. And so I had remembered from grad school the attachment modality of couples work, that one of them that we were taught was EFT, which is attachment based. And I lived in Los Angeles at the time. I just immediately dropped what I was doing, found the first training in the country, which happened to be in Bozeman, Montana, dropped everything, flew out to Bozeman the next week, I think, to get the training. And so two things happened from that. One, I never took on another individual as a new client since that day. I've only worked with couples since that day. I fell in love with couples work. And the second thing that happened is my family and I, 4 months later, lived in Bozeman, Montana. I fell in love with couples work, and I fell in love with Montana on that trip. And so anyway, then, many years into doing the work, somehow I got onto Instagram. It was very random. I won't go into details about how that happened, but I opened this account, and I thought, well, if I have an account, I have to post something. I really just opened the account because I have a clinic here in Bozeman, to kind of have that name out there, I guess, for people who are in Bozeman. And I thought, well, I have to post something, so I'll just post about what I know. And I started posting about attachment theory, and it just really took off. I think at the time people were kind of getting familiarized with the terminology around that: secure and insecure, and avoidant and anxious. And I don't know, if it was kind of like the right place at the right time, and it took off. And then I got this tremendous opportunity to teach people about attachment theory, and really more than teaching them about the theory, but teaching them how to use, from my perspective, attachment theory is the closest science has come to really helping us and put words to understanding what makes relationships work and what makes them struggle. And I have become an expert at using that information to actually help people heal. And so I'm trying to take what I'm doing with the couples in my private practice and apply that in a self-help way to people out there who just don't have access to any kind of other help, or do and want, kind of a supplement. And yeah, so then that really brought me to this place where I can touch a lot of lives. And I wrote a book, and to kind of walk people through the process that I used with my couples in my practice, who teach me everything I know. And yeah, so here I am with you, and it's good to be here.
Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
You really went into a detailed like explanation of how you got here, even back to your childhood. And I want to touch on that a little bit to allow the listeners to have like a full picture of who
Hmm.
you are, and to allow them to have a deeper connection to you, because I think it makes your work so much more relatable and helps people to get to know you and understand you on a personal level. So I'd like to start with your early life, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about the emotional dynamic that was in your family when you were younger, because you said that there wasn't like a lot of, I guess, emotional understanding or
Hmm.
maturity. What was it like in your family system?
Well, I think a lot of people might relate to what I'm about to say, which is there was absolutely zero emotional support. Um,
Mm,
Direct emotional support, talking about feelings, validating feelings. I mean, if anything, I think it was more emotionally shaming, like whatever feeling maybe you showed or um, brought, maybe even I'm trying to imagine even putting words to a feeling growing up. If I would have, though, it would have definitely not been tended to in a helpful way. Um, but the tricky part here, and I think this is where a lot of people get tripped up, is I felt loved. I did feel loved. I knew that my parents loved me and, generally had my best interest in mind. And so it was really, for many years, it was really confusing to marry those two. It's like, what could have possibly gone wrong? I know I was loved, but at the same time, there's all this terrible stuff going on. And I never felt emotionally supported. And it took me a while to kind of come to the reality that there's two truths. We can grow up in an environment where we know our parents love us and have our backs for the most part, but we also don't get what we need, enough of what we need to go forward and have healthy relationships. So it was a very emotionally invalidating environment. And it was, I felt kind of very lonely. I felt alone almost all the time. I remember just kind of a pervasive feeling of loneliness, which is why I developed my fantasy family. Um,
mm,
and then on top of that, my dad, all the needs in the home centered around my dad. Every need, everything was about him and accommodating his needs. And my mom, kind of set the tone for that. And so it really affected me in the sense that um, I, sort of, I did it kind of a combination of, on one hand, in relationships, the needs centered around me, but on the other hand, I'm sorry, let me say this. On the surface, it looked like I would place a partner's needs above my own, but underneath the surface, there was this strong feeling of a lack of fairness. So if anything ever felt unfair and like their needs were more important to mine in a moment, I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. And to this day, if something feels unfair to me, I get really triggered because I observed it being so unfair in my household. But I still also have a tendency to act out putting another's needs above my own, if that makes sense.
it does.
Kind of a confusing thing that I'm sure a lot of people struggle with. It's like you want it, but you hate it at the same time.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what you described, I know I can relate to it, because I grew up in a similar environment where emotions were invalidated. You were shamed for being emotional
Mhm.
because if you had big feelings, um, no one knew what to do with them. So
Right.
instead of trying to understand them, you were, placed in the corner, or said that you had
Mhm.
emotional issues, or you were needy, or what have you. So in your experience, do you feel like you noticed any attachment patterns that developed because of that specifically?
Oh, for sure. Just all over the place.
Mhm.
The ways that my parents would get triggered by my behavior were directly related to their own attachment wounds. Feeling fear, it just, it all kind of circles back to fear and their own feelings of being misunderstood or alone or out of control of a situation. And so, you know, um, I think with my dad, it was like his needs were so all consuming. He was like an inlet, an empty bucket where you could never fill up his needs because
Mm.
he didn't know what they were. It was all intimacy disorder, right? And so when people have a problem actually maintaining and feeling connection with others, they're going to be scrambling around all over the place trying to get that need met. And so when they don't really know how to get what they're needing, you can never satisfy that, right? And so they just become, I mean, he was just like constantly needing more and more and more. And so that kind of turned into really a selfishness, right? Which
Mm.
I really believe, you know, humans just in general, when humans don't have their needs met, we all get scared and feel empty and are going to prioritize our own needs in whatever way. It can look like people pleasing, it can look like, whatever. And so he was, behaved very selfishly. And I say that selfishly with a lot of compassion, as a reflection of unmet needs. And then, when someone's consumed with their own needs, unmet needs, they certainly can't show up for another person very well. And then same thing with my mom. It's just that her way of acting out her unmet needs were to be people pleasing and accommodating to him. And so it's almost like two children with unmet needs who are just kind of all consumed with themselves. How are you going to, the kids are not getting anything that they need met. So I felt really anxious all the time, because in this other kind of twisted up way, my mom was super physically affectionate when I was really young. And so I just remember like just desperately wanting to be clung to her at all times. And if I wasn't, then I felt just completely empty and alone and even angry. And that was tricky because a lot of the time she wasn't physically available. So it was just, I guess I could continue talking for another hour about what those unmet needs were, but it was the system was so mired in unmet needs, like no needs were met in this system.
Well, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that personal experience. And I think, with your experience and how relatable it is, I think you are almost perfect for what you do and helping others with those, same issues that they may be suffering from because you've been there, you've done that. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're very welcome. Let me add something to that too, that I don't know why this just came up, but I had my dad's mom was great. She was my grandma. She lived very close. So I spent a lot of time with her and she actually did know how to connect. And I don't know how, how she learned that. I think her mom was very emotionally available too. She didn't help me necessarily talk about my feelings, but she knew how to see me. She knew how to kind of validate where I was and just accept me for who I was. So I also got kind of a taste of that and how good that felt. So I think that kind of
Mhm.
plays into, the picture of what I do also is having a sense of what the needs do feel like when they're met.
Sure, I can understand that.
Yeah.
Um, so because of your experience as a child and your early relationships at home, how did that affect your love life? And do you remember your first experience of falling in love?
You know, I felt I don't really know that it was actual love, but I did feel very strongly for a boyfriend in high school and got my heart broken. This was someone who, was similar to my dad in the sense that they couldn't really show up, but um, the I don't know the relationship sort of matched up. I guess I did have a tendency to only want to be with people who couldn't really show up, and I think that's just what I felt comfortable with. And then I dated here and there and had a few kind of serious boyfriends um, through college, but then I met my husband at the end of college. So I didn't have a lot of experience falling in love with people until he came along. And then I fell in love with him and he actually can be there for me. He actually, you know, probably what not probably, for sure, the reason that I fell in love with him is because for the first time in my life, maybe other than my grandma, he was just curious about me. He just cared about who I was as a person, my interests. And I just remember, you know, like I have an image of sitting with him in a room and him being like, well, tell me about your childhood. Well, tell me about this, because he's a very curious person. And I remember just being blown away that someone was asking me questions about myself. And so that's, to me, I guess love is having people be interested in who I am. That's what
Mm.
I learned, you know, and he's also a very fascinating person. That helped. He stimulates my intellectual part. We're very intellectual together. Uh, but with that said, you know, I did fall right into the pattern of, putting him on a pedestal and kind of just doing everything in my power to make him happy. But then at the same time, underneath that, struggling with this feeling of like, if anything's unfair, then, you know, I get really, that was a really painful place for me to feel that anything is unfair. So I've
Mm.
had in my work through love, it has been to, one, balance needs between both of us. I think the way to explain that, it was like I would bounce back and forth between it's all his needs, or when I'm triggered, it's all my needs. And there was never really like taking situations and moments when there was some sort of rupture and stepping back and looking at them as like, hey, we both have needs here. We both have legitimate needs. We both have really good reasons for seeing things the way we do or acting in the way we do. What's going on, instead of just feeling like you have to just wholly accommodate one or wholly accommodate the other.
Mm. Thank you for that. Did you ever struggle like communicating early on, or you fell in love with him and he made
Mhm.
you feel like the best version of you?
Mhm.
And you did mention that you had some issues where it was either all him or all you, but
Mhm.
in between that, like, what was the communication like getting to those both sides of that?
Oh yeah, I had definitely had communication problems. I mean, I didn't know how to talk about. I couldn't say, "Hey, look, in these moments when it seems like you're not really considering my needs, that feels really unfair." And in that unfairness, I feel kind of alone, and it's a sad place for me. And can you help me out here? Can we work together here? No, absolutely. If all this stuff got triggered, I had no words for it. I didn't even. It was just this vague experience of discomfort. And as more of the anxious partner, my way of dealing with that discomfort was to be protesting. You don't even care about me, just that kind of anxious partner protest place where we're trying to express I'm in pain here, but it's coming out as like, you're all bad, you're all wrong, you never do this, you never do that. So yeah, that's how I tried to reach him, for sure.
With all of, I guess, your professional work and then your home life and trying to balance the two of them, was there ever anything that gave you like a book or a song or a favorite movie that like helped you or influenced you?
Uh, my not really, because anything I can say about a movie or a song, it was just more like resonated with my experience, but it didn't necessarily help my relationship. Nothing really helped my relationship until I discovered attachment theory and really was able to dive into the details of what makes love thrive and how to do it. That's really what helped me more profoundly than anything else. I mean, I enjoy movies, I enjoy songs about love, but as far as learning anything from that, no.
How far were you into your relationship when you found this training and went to Bozeman?
I was like, we had been married for about 18 years.
Mm,
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
it wasn't, we never struggled. Like, it wasn't like it had our relationship always had a lot of strengths. But would say, when did it was more like 2012 when I started learning about all of this. And that's when things started to really improve, really being able to see patterns that I wasn't able to see before, really understand why, what my distress is about, how I'm trying to manage that distress, and how the way I manage that distress impacts him and what happens for him emotionally, and then how he tries to stay safe from those emotions and manage those emotions in ways that then, re-trigger me. And we're just throwing all these triggers back and forth. And neither of us are really having any clue about what our actual emotional needs are, our actual, emotional slash attachment needs. So I think once I went back to grad school, I'm trying to think if there wasn't really any resource before that really helped me understand it. And, that's probably why I do what I do, because it's helped my life, in so many ways. And then I've helped so many couples with it. So maybe there's something to be said for the fact that nothing ever helped me before that. So I'm very biased toward that attachment perspective.
Sure. I don't think there's a bad thing to be biased about
Yeah.
whatsoever.
Well, good. I don't want
So,
to be like too much like I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, but my experience is my experience. So
I mean, if you make the Kool-Aid, you can drink it. So,
yeah, there you go. There's no poison in it, to my knowledge. Terrible thing
um,
to be proud of. I shouldn't laugh about that. Terrible tragedy, but I have a dark humor sometimes.
it's all good. So for those who may not be familiar with your work, we've talked a lot about what you do, but I would like for you to try and describe what your mission is behind the secure relationship.
Oh gosh, my mission is to really help couples. I mean, in the simplest of terms, to help couples meet each other's attachment needs and create secure attachment. It all boils down to that underneath all of it. And, underneath the surface, I see couples that are struggling with every problem out there. I've seen every different walk of life, uh, different cultures, different countries, different genders, different, sexual orientations, the whole deal. And everybody at the end of the day is having the same problem. They're not meeting each other's attachment needs. It just shows up differently. And there aren't that many attachment needs. We need to feel seen. We need to feel understood. We need to feel valued. We need to feel wanted. We need to feel appreciated. We need to know that if I reach for you for emotional help, you're going to be there for me. Some couples do that in a real, way that they explicitly put words to that. Some couples don't have the explicit words, but they still manage to do it. But it's all underneath the surface that really what makes a relationship loving and thriving is the ability to reach each other emotionally and meet these needs. And then from that, they can work through their logistical life problems so much more easily. They can work through financial issues or parenting issues or whatever their surface level disagreements might be. There are situations where a couple they do get to the point where they can be with each other emotionally and they've got that part healthy, but they still have these incompatibilities that are not workable, right? Where, I I want a family. You don't want a family. That's not workable for us. We're too far apart there. And that might be a good reason for them to go separate ways. But if we get to that point, I want to have stabilized the emotional and attachment connection and the way that they communicate with each other so that they can do that parting from a place of health and clear understanding of what the real problem was. Because a lot of times what looks like incompatibility is really just an attachment mess.
Mhm. So
And
for
most of
somebody
the
who's,
time, I would say that was the case most of the time.
I see,
Yeah.
for somebody who's listening and you've got their attention and they're like, okay, so if I had to explain to someone what I heard on this podcast about attachment, what would be an easy way to explain what attachment is?
Attachment is what helps you feel safe and close to another person. And if you cannot feel safe and close with another person, nothing will work. It will not work. It is a game changer. If enough of the time you're in a relationship with someone where you enough of the time don't feel safe and enough of the time don't feel emotionally close, and you can't repair and get back to it if that gets ruptured, because all couples that gets ruptured, every couple out there, the healthiest couple out there, we're all human. We all come to relationships with baggage. We're all going to have a moment where we feel like unsafe or unseen or an attachment rupture, right? But the healthy couples are able to repair and get back to, we feel safe with each other. We can talk to each other about hard topics. We're not going to feel shamed. We're not going to feel invalidated. We're not going to feel put down. That's what I mean by unsafety. And so my job is to create secure attachment, which is a felt sense of safety, emotional safety, and emotional closeness in the relationship. And so if a couple is not having that, I've got to work backwards and I've got to figure out, how are you guys communicating in a way that is unmeeting your needs, emotional needs? And how can I help you now communicate whatever we have to do to get there? I've got to figure out, what are the blocks here? Why are you not able to communicate in the healthiest way possible? And how can I help you fix that? And I've got to get you guys, whatever it is you're talking about, I've got to get you to the point where you're communicating about it in a way that feels safe and your attachment needs are being met and there's emotional connection. And then, the other piece of that is I've also got to get it to where, you're emotional, you can reach to each other for emotional support, just independent of talking about hard topics. And then a lot of times sex is a piece of that. Sex is sort of under the rubric of emotional support. Sex is a physical way to feel emotional connection. So sometimes we have to work on that too.
Are there different types of attachment styles? And if so, can you explain which ones they are?
Yeah. So when someone has an attachment rupture, meaning they feel, either overall in the big picture of the relationship, or just in a moment something happens and they feel a feeling of disconnection or a feeling of invalidation, a feeling of not being appreciated or not being understood or not being valuable, that is a trigger. That's going to create a trigger. Anytime someone has that experience in their relationship, if the relationship actually matters to their nervous system, that is going to create like something's not right here. And if a person handles that by getting really overwhelmed with anxiety and pushing and putting the pressure on and protesting and kind of acting out and trying to desperately get the partner's attention, do something different, help me out here because I feel disconnected. And that might look like protesting, you don't care about me, trying to get them to see your pain, trying to control them into changing. It could look like, sometimes it looks like just anything to get their attention, calling them repeatedly, or any kind of acting out. That would be called an anxious attachment, because that person is anxiously trying to get help with the pain of disconnection. And then if someone is kind of doing the opposite, where they're not asking for help, they're not reaching for help, instead they're just kind of pulling away, distancing from whatever is causing the pain. They don't even recognize there is pain sometimes, just trying to kind of soothe their own emotions or distract from their own pain. That would be called an avoidant attachment. They're, instead of anxiously trying to reach, they're avoiding the trigger. And a lot of time, and then you have a disorganized attachment, which is someone who kind of bounces around between the two. And they tend to, there's a lot of layers to disorganized attachment. Some people say, well, it's just a mixture of anxious and avoidant, but it's really not. It's more like a mixture of some anxious tendencies, some avoidant tendencies, a lot of trauma, a lot of emotional reactivity, just a more chaotic experience. And so typically what happens is that someone with an anxious attachment is going to be paired up with someone with an avoidant attachment. And if they don't start off that way and they don't know how to be emotionally healthy with each other, they'll usually fall into that pattern. Because what happens is the relationship needs emotional balance. So imbalance is when they're either fighting all the time or they're completely disconnected. And so to fall into balance, what's going to happen is one partner is going to take on more of the anxious role to close the distance, while the other partner is going to take on more of the avoidant role to keep things from getting worse. So it kind of keeps this like not optimal level of balance, but then it falls apart when it's not sustainable. And so what's going to happen is usually it's going to end up in periodic fights that they don't know how to get through together. And then what happens is these couples, typically this anxious and avoidant, is they have a status quo, and then all of a sudden they bump up against a topic they do not know how to deal with. They get into a fight, which I call negative cycles. One partner's protesting, the other one's defending. The first protesting partner feels invalidated, and then they amp it up, and then the defending partner, which is typically the avoidant, eventually they might try to appease, and then they just shut down. And then this couple goes off in their separate corners and they're mad at each other, but then the loneliness starts to creep in and they make their way back to each other, but they haven't really resolved the real issue, which is the attachment wounds that happen during these fights and the attachment, ruptures and wounds that might be happening in the big picture of the relationship.
Something that you mentioned was trauma. And I know that trauma can lead to attachment wounds even prior to, a couple being in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you, in your professional opinion, what is trauma and how can trauma prevent vulnerability in relationships?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say that, trauma is attachment wounds. It's all the same thing, kind of for me, it's all really kind of the same thing. Not really. Let me say this. All trauma is going to involve attachment wounds, but you can have people who have attachment dysfunction in their childhood that I don't know that we would call, we might call it little T trauma. Big T trauma to me is anything that affects someone's nervous system to the degree that their nervous system can't cope with whatever's happening to them. Some physical abuse, sexual abuse, extreme emotional abuse. And then so their nervous system learns to be really afraid of those events happening again. And then what do people do when they're afraid? They try to manage the fear. They try to avoid the thing that made them scared, or, typically that, and try to make sure that they never get back in that situation. And then a lot of times the ways that people try to manage the pain and fear around whatever happened to them aren't ways that are pro relationship. They're protective, and it could cause, emotional reactivity, overreactions. It just kind of wreaks havoc on the way that a person shows up in relationships, because there's really not a lot of room for unprocessed and unexpressed fear in relationships. If you can have, if you're operating your relationship with a partner based on fear of rejection, fear of your needs not mattering, fear of not being valued, you're going to behave in a way that makes those fears more, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're going to behave in a way that makes those feelings those fears more likely to come true, because the behavior is going to impact the relationship in a way that creates negative cycles. But if your relationship, the way that you're motivated in your relationship is, I'm motivated by feeling connected. I want to strive for connection instead of I fear disconnection. It's going to look very different. And so people who've had trauma, to come full circle with all this, they're motivated by fear. Because their nervous system, they have experienced bad things. Little T trauma, I would say, is experiencing emotional rejection, experiencing shame, experiencing invalidation. And those things all impact a relationship. A relationship can go just as far south with those things having happened in someone's past as it can with all the big T trauma, which, like I said, is more of like serious physical abuse, all sexual abuse, all physical abuse, serious emotional issues.
Do you think that if someone has had enough little T traumas of, emotional abuse or invalidation or anything of that nature, that it can present as a big T trauma?
Yes, that is, you know, absolutely. That's all it takes. I like to say, I don't know if you're familiar with DBT, Marsha Linehan, borderline personality disorder. So, have you heard that term, borderline personality disorder?
No.
Okay, it's a pretty, I think that it's to me, borderline personality is just disorganized attachment, although not everyone with disorganized attachment has borderline personality, but it's a personality disorder. I don't even like this term so much, but I'll just use it because it's used, where someone just has pervasive relationship problems. They fear abandonment, they fear rejection, they don't trust, and it wreaks all sorts of havoc in their life. And you're going to see a lot of suicidality, all kinds of extreme relationship, all kinds of extreme behaviors when this person has a relationship trigger. And there's a psychologist, a very well-known psychologist, Marsha Linehan, who's done a tremendous amount of work. And she actually created a modality to help people with borderline personality disorder. But one of the pieces of her work that I love the most is that, she did this study to figure out like what all these people have in common. And, for this really distressing disorder. And the one thing they all had in common, it wasn't big T trauma. They all had grown up in emotionally invalidating homes. That's all it took.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Mm, yeah.
Wow.
That stuck with me. I read that many, many, many years ago, and that's always stuck with me.
You mentioned something that I wanted to circle back to, and that was trust. And I wanted to ask, how important is vulnerability in building trust and connection and security in a relationship?
Mhm. Well, people are going to make sense of relationship problems. Everybody is going to make sense of it. That's how we try to stay safe, is if we can make sense of the problem, then we have some idea of how we might go about fixing the problem. And so if we're making sense of the problem, which a lot of people do, as my partner's actually trying to hurt me. My partner really doesn't love me. My partner doesn't care about me at all. They really are just this selfish person. We're going to, that making sense of it in that way is going to affect how you interact with your partner. Right. And that's going to create problems. That is, not making sense of the issue based on pain and vulnerability that we're struggling with, that is causing us to act in these ways to try to stay safe, right? So, the way that I need for couples to reframe is for them to make sense of their problems, like I just said. Like, this isn't us hating each other, this isn't us really truly not caring. This is just actually we're struggling with these pains from our past and pains from the current relationship and these fears and these wounds, and we're scrambling around trying to keep ourselves safe and feel better in these ways that hurt each other. I mean, and we're not able to be clear about what the real issue is. So when I can get couples to be vulnerable and really get down into the pain and speak from that place, all of a sudden they're able to make sense of all the problems in a totally new way. They have more empathy for each other. They have more understanding. They have more empathy for themselves and understanding of themselves. And now they can start connecting instead of disconnecting. I do a podcast with a real couple. So I take the real couple through 20 sessions of therapy, this kind of therapy, to help people, kind of bring the process alive for people. And I'm recording season 2 right now. And I just finished with this couple actually right before we hopped on. And, the male partner, who's the anxious partner, he really struggles with, he makes sense of their problems. Like I said, is she not only doesn't care about me, but she's actively trying to hurt me. I've told her over and over again what I need emotionally, and she's not showing up for me. And so his brain, because of some childhood stuff that he went through, goes right to, she's actually trying to hurt me. Well, that's really not the case. I'm not saying that, I think maybe some relationships partners really actually are trying to hurt each other. But even then, it's more about trying to get their own needs met. But regardless, because because his brain and body go right when he gets triggered without even consciously thinking about it, that's where he goes. Right. So if you really believe in the moment that your partner's actively trying to hurt you, what are you going to do? Are you going to be vulnerable? No, you're going to protect yourself. And so I've got to get I've got to get both of them more into vulnerability so they're able to speak to each other in a way that helps them see we're not trying to hurt each other. We're actually not enemies. We're trying to reach each other. These negative cycles we get stuck in are the actual real enemy.
Wow, it was so deep. And you mentioned like if someone believes something, I mean, they can make that their reality in the moment, and is what their brain will then try and protect them, so they will
Absolutely.
do whatever they need to do.
And for him, the safety in that idea that my wife really is malicious and wants to harm me is that if that's the case, I have permission to bolt. I have permission to
Mhm.
get out of here.
Wow. So, what do you do to help couples create a secure bond? What does that look like?
Well, first, I help them see the pattern. I help them see these negative cycles. Like, here's what's happening: you're trying to reach each other emotionally, or you're trying to stay safe and get somehow help yourselves and get help from each other. And instead, you're going to all these. You're trying to do that in a way that's protesting, criticizing each other, stonewalling each other, attacking each other, defending yourselves, not everything, but able to kind of talk about really what your real feelings are and step into each other's worlds and try to see their perspective, their emotional perspective. So I've got to first get them to see this is what you're doing, right? And this is why you're doing it. Part of why you're doing it is because you're carrying around this attachment style that has been your way of dealing with your bad feelings, your bad relationship feelings. And then once I can kind of get them to see the pattern, then kind of simultaneously as we go, I'm in the sessions helping them do new things. Like instead of just saying to your partner, for example, this man that I'm speaking of in the podcast, when he gets triggered by her, when he gets a message from her, whether it's deliberate on her, it's never intentional on her part. It's like usually negative cycles aren't intentionally trying to send messages. I hate you and I don't want to be there for you. But when he picks up the message from his own perception, she messes up and his body and his nervous system goes to, here we are again. She's malicious. Look, what am I doing in this? I just got to get out of this. That happens in 1/30th of a second, that thought process. It's not even a thought process. It's just this subconscious like mess of a trigger. What does he do? He goes, you need to get out of here. You need to just pack up and get out of here. Right? For her, what is she seeing? She's seeing this callous jerk who is just like all of a sudden randomly kicking her out. She's more of the avoidant partner. So a lot of times she doesn't even know what she did wrong. Right? So what do I need to do with him? I need to have a long conversation with him and take that 1/30th of a second and stretch it out and figure out what happens in that 1/30th of a second that you need to immediately go to get out of my life. There's so much. There's fear. There's a sense of loneliness. There's a sense of, demoralization and it's a scary place to be. And I can't live like this forever. It's too painful. And I'm in a state of disconnection and I feel so yucky and awful and I don't know what to do. So what I've learned to do is make sense of it as they can't really possibly love me. They can't have my best interests in mind. And so I've got to get away from this person. And so I have to have him telling her about all that. I have to have him turn to her and say, look, when you hear me saying, just get out of here, here's what's really happening in my heart. I don't really want to push you away. I'm trying to push away how painful it feels for me to be so scared and in such a state of disconnection and, all the stuff that comes along with that. And then when she can hear that, she softens. She doesn't feel so threatened. Her threat system goes down. She's able to be more open to seeing more about him there's more to it than that. I mean, they've got to be able to do that. Part of the work is in the sessions, them being able to see these things for what they really are, instead of seeing this enemy negative cycle set up. And then, as that starts to shift their nervous system, shift their perspective, and then they've got to start doing that work outside of the session where they're able to have these conversations instead of these triggers launching them into these horrible fights. They're able to step back and, just one partner is able to step back and go, all right, hold on. What's going on with me? This is one of those moments where I get scared and, my body just wants to react in this way. What can I kind of do differently here? But when they're both able to do that and really meet each other and not just be able to communicate that, but able to hold each other when the other one communicates that. It has to be both sided. We have to be able to communicate it, and we have to be able to be receptive to it and take a moment with that person's feelings. Okay, I get it. This is one of those moments where, I did so and so, you felt let down, and you're over there going, you've told me 1,000 times how to get it right. And, I hear you. I get upset when I feel dropped to, and it makes sense to me, and I'm sorry you're hurting, and how can I help you? Right. And then just stay with that. And maybe later that person goes and says, hey, I just kind of want to talk about my part of the situation too. Sometimes I'm not getting clear signals from you about what you're needing. And, then whatever their stuff is too. A lot of times there's a timing issue with partners where they get into these cycles where they're just going back and forth between needs. And so I've got to get them to a place where they're sitting with one person's needs at a time in a given moment when they're trying to work through something, attachment needs or emotional needs. One person is kind of wearing the attachment hat where they have the needs, and the other person is in the caregiving role. They're there to support that person, and they give enough space to that instead of bouncing back and forth. But that's happening on both ends. One person isn't living in the needing role. They're both bouncing back and forth in the big picture of being a support and being the one taking and receiving.
I was going to say it would probably be so important for one person to be able to be in the role of being an attachment, the other person being able to take their hat off if they both have attachment styles that can be negative to the relationship. And when they have those moments, if they're both in those attachments, then one won't be able to hold space for the other. So for you to be able to allow them to see what's happening and say, hey, listen, when he's here or when she's here, you have to shift out of that to hold space for him or her. And then that allows for the communication to actually happen.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's what needs to happen. And it, if it were as simple as a couple showing up to me and on the first day, I just say, hey, go do this.
Mhm.
Wouldn't that be nice? But it's not. It's not just, look, this is the way out. But now we got to figure out what are all the very good reasons that you have blocks to getting there. What might prevent you from being able to be in that supportive role? You get triggered, you get scared, you have all these wounds in the past, you don't trust it, you don't trust your needs will get met. There's lots of good reasons. And so we've got to kind of work through all of those reasons. And it isn't really until we've done a lot of safety building that they are able to start slowly getting to the point where they can regulate enough to be able to show up as that supportive presence.
Right. Yeah. Because if your nervous system has been dysregulated since childhood, this process, not only are you building a secure attachment in your relationship, but I would think you would also be doing some reparenting to that inner child or inner children as well.
100%. Yeah. I mean, that's really half of what I do in my sessions with couples is creating security in their relationship. And the other half of what I'm doing is helping them create security within themselves, which is, like you said, the reparenting process. They both have to be happening hand in hand for this to work. And that is
Sure.
being able to show up for yourself emotionally, whether that's being able to show up and help yourself when your emotions are all big, or whether that's if you're able to kind of access your emotions to begin with so that you can help them instead of having to shove them away. And then simultaneously helping each other with the emotions. So it's kind of both. It's both, if we, we have a relationship with ourselves first and foremost. That's what we're going to carry with us. That's the common denominator throughout our whole lives, to feel good in the world and to be able to do well in the world and have a good life. But if you're in a relationship, for that relationship to thrive, you have to also be able to help each other out with your emotions, which is called co-regulation. So it's kind of like I'm always doing this combination of self-regulation and co-regulation, self-regulation and co-regulation, and it all works together.
Um, Something that can happen as a result of there not being security in a relationship is infidelity, which is often a deepful and painful, complex issue. In your experience, what are some common reasons that you see for infidelity in relationships?
Well, it's attachment issues. I mean, it's like if someone is not feeling valued, I mean, that's a painful place to be. It's really easy to say, someone is just cold and heartless or selfish or whatever. But underneath that, let's say someone doesn't feel valued. I mean, that's a really strong human need to feel wanted, to feel connected to. And people will go to great lengths to soothe the pain around not having those needs met. And sometimes what some people do is they go get those needs met from other people. They know it's not the right thing to do, or they know there's a downside and a consequence, but it's like, the need is so strong that it's, for their nervous systems in the moment. And it's the payoff is a feeling that all humans are really striving for, which is, like I said, connectedness and feeling wanted, feeling desired, feeling like someone's curious about you, and people will fight very hard to get that need met. I
When you
mean, I think
have,
too, there might sometimes be, people have infidelity for different reasons, right? I mean, it's all going to be attachment related at the end of the day. But someone else, they might be doing it as a protest, try to get their partner's attention. I feel so alone in the relationship. I feel so disconnected. It's so painful. I need you to hear me. My words aren't getting through. So, and it doesn't necessarily happen consciously. So I'm going to do anything in my power to try to get your attention. Even if they're not telling the person about the affair, we can still be doing something subconsciously to try to get their attention. Yeah. So go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, when you have a couple that comes to you after they've experienced infidelity in their relationship, what are some of the first steps that you recommend to begin the healing process?
Well, I mean, the first thing I have to do is help them make sense of what happened. Again, people will come to me, and the way that they'll be making sense of it is they're they're selfish, they're bad, they're uncaring, their dad was the same way, and they, all these reasons, right? And there could be, truth. Like I said, there's truth to people behaving selfishly. That's what people do when their needs aren't met, is they get preoccupied with getting their needs met. So I've got to help them make sense of it through an attachment lens. And it's difficult because you'd never want to invalidate the wounded partner. You never want to say, well, it's your fault, right? But you also have to balance that out with, look, there clearly was some things going wrong in the relationship, unmet needs here that both of you were struggling with, that caused this acting out to begin with. A lot of times, if you have someone had an affair and that looks like the big bad thing, but then when you really dive in, you find out, well, the other partner was completely being neglectful or critical or attacking all the time or whatever. That doesn't give the person an excuse to have an affair. I mean, people choose to deal with their pain. Ultimately, we all have power over our choices, and there's no amount of bad relationship that can make someone choose to have an affair to deal with those feelings. But when you step back, you can see that there were bad behaviors going on both sides of the street. One just maybe have been objectively worse than the other, right? But we got to clean all of this up. We got to figure out what is the attachment gunk happening that led to this acting out that we call the affair. And then when we can sort of get more of that understanding on board, and I've got to get both partners communicating about the affair in a healthy way. Right. So here's what's not healthy. I just can't believe you did that. How could you do that to me? You know how much I love you after all I've given you my whole life. How could you do that? That's just a protest. That's not, there's truth to it. Sure. But that isn't really sharing vulnerably about how you were impacted and what happened for you in the, here's what this was like for me. I felt abandoned, and it took me to this insecure place. And then what's not healthy is the other person going, I know, I can't believe I did it. I feel so terrible about myself. I mean, there's truth to that too, but they're not really, they're kind of switching the subject to their own shame spiral, when really in this moment, I need for that person that had the affair to show up and say, hey, I get it. I get out of defensiveness. And I hear how wounded you are. I hear that. I'm really getting a clearer picture of how you were emotionally impacted by this. And it was awful. It was an awful experience for you. That's just, basic validation. But on the other side of it, I've also got to get the person who had the affair to be sharing their part of what it was like for them to walk around in the relationship feeling their pain. Not out of blame, but just like I was in so much pain. Every day I woke up and felt like I didn't have anywhere to go, anyone to reach to. And it was a lonely, terrible place. And I have all these wounds from childhood where my nervous system remembers how lonely I felt. And I don't want to go back there. And, the way that all translated for me is I went and found it somewhere else. And I'm not making excuses for that, but that was my way of trying to stay safe from this terrible pain. And then the other person, instead of saying, well, still you shouldn't have done that, or that's not my problem, they're able to dive in and kind of separate themselves from their own wounded place and say, hey, I get it. I'm really getting a clear picture of how horrible that must have been for you. There's a lot of pain there. And it makes sense to me that when humans are suffering, we scramble around trying to find ways to soothe that pain. And in the process of talking about it in this new way, they're actually experiencing the very connection that's the antidote to affairs.
Thank you for sharing that. That was very, very insightful.
You're welcome.
So a question I want to ask is, do you believe that a relationship can fully recover and thrive after infidelity? And if so, what does that journey typically look like?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can use the affair as an opportunity to heal the wounds that weren't working, the wounds and what wasn't working that kind of led up to the affair happening. And just to be clear, I've never come across a relationship where there was just an affair out of thin air. There's always something that was going on in the relationship that wasn't working, right? But there also is something to be said for the fact that some people are vulnerable to affairs because of their own stuff, in addition to, the stuff in the relationship. Some people are more likely to have an affair to deal with their pain for whatever reason. So we also have some personal issues that we need to be working through at the same time. But yeah, so when people can figure out like what wasn't going wrong and repair that stuff, and then figure out what's going wrong inside of me that I needed to have an affair to help heal my pain or help myself emotionally. What can I start doing instead of helping myself emotionally by having an affair? What are some other options here for me? So that it just gradually starts to clean everything up. They start just by having these conversations. They're now bonding with each other. They're not having the same fight over and over because they know how to navigate it with safety and closeness. And then on top of that, we need to have these healing conversations. All these attachment wounds, they need to be talked about directly in a way that is healing, instead of, like I said, one partner staying in blame and accusations at the expense of their vulnerability and the other partner staying in defensiveness or shame spiral, instead of them being able to be vulnerable. And just the act of being able to do that shows up in all parts of the relationship. And, one thing that needs to happen is the wounded partner really needs to be able to keep bringing it up and have healing. Sometimes it's not just a healing conversation isn't one and done. The person who was wounded, they might have it triggered randomly. They see a stop sign, and somehow that stop sign reminds them of the affair, they need to be able to reach to the partner and say, hey, listen, I got this trigger. I just want to talk about how painful it was. Can you just be there for me? And the other person's like, I'm here for you. You can always bring it up to me. I love you. I know that was the worst time for you, whatever, without it going into this place of, why do we have to keep talking about the same thing over and over? And when you can have these repeated interactions about it in a healthy way, right? It will go on indefinitely. The conversations will go on indefinitely if they're not happening in a healthy way. But when couples can have these repeated reparative conversations, eventually they stop needing to have them. It's kind of like grief. If someone you're really close to passes away, you're going to have lots of crying spells. You're going to be spending a lot of time crying right when this happens. You might need to talk about it all the time with people as a support system, but then, from your support systems, but then as time goes by, you need to do that less and less and less. But you might always have grief, around the person's death, but it only gets triggered, a couple times a year instead of all day long, every day at the beginning.
Sure. Thank you for that explanation.
You're welcome.
Is there a particular story or transformation that stayed with you, either from a client or someone whose life has been changed by understanding attachment, that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, that would be my own story. And, again, I work with couples, but there's this kind of disconnect between what I do and where I've had the most transformation in my own life. Where I've had the most transformation in my own life, I would say would be one, my relationship with myself, but two, it's the profound way that attachment theory has improved my relationship with my children. And every day I have the opportunity to show up for them emotionally instead of getting lost in my own trigger. Or, my oldest daughter brought something to me today that she felt was unfair about the way I was treating her versus over a certain topic versus one of her younger sisters. And she first came at me kind of with a little bit of like accusation, like, this is not fair, kind of a protesty. And, in the past, it would have been really easy for me to be like, oh my gosh, you sound this, in my mind, at least, to be like, gosh, she's so entitled. How can she, this isn't even accurate, all this stuff. And then respond to her like, listen, you're not getting it right. That's not true. And like put out all these details of why she's seeing it the wrong way. And now I know, okay, I got to step back from my own stuff and I need to show up for her and, really kind of try to see her perspective here. When I stepped back, I could really see where she was coming from. I was like, okay, this isn't, there's some truth to what she's saying. There's also some stuff that feels inaccurate to me, but I was able to just kind of step into her world and go, you know what? I can see that. You're right. Like, I really do see that this, could, isn't necessarily the most fair thing. And I'm willing to remedy that. And, it sounds like I'm kind of indulging that, but I'm really not. I was able to just kind of validate her feelings and where she was coming from, and kind of put all the inaccuracies to the side, that this is for later, after I've kind of been with her, clearly she's in distress, kind of help her with that. Then later I might go in and say, listen, I just want to kind of talk to you about some of the perceptions here. And here's kind of where I'm coming from. Like, this didn't feel so true to me. But I didn't do that. And I stayed with her, and I didn't even have to do that because she did it for herself. Because all of a sudden, when people feel safe and heard and understood, their nervous systems relax. They're not so threatened, and they can go into more of a rational place in their brain. And then her texts to me after that were like, you know what? I really get that, I came in strong, and I really see that, maybe I'm missing some things. And so she was able to kind of self-reflect and get herself more into that balanced perspective because I was able to show up for her emotionally. So now apply that logic to all your relationships, right? I can now do that with my husband. But, for some reason, it just feels like doing that with my children was, I don't know, more profound because maybe I'm, as the caretaker of children, there's less of a, reciprocal relationship there. I don't know, but that's my transformation.
Well, also, I would think that because you're able to do it for your children, and maybe you didn't get that, it means so much more to you. And for you to be able to not be defensive and for your nervous system to be regulated when, that's unloaded on you, it shows how much personal work you've done.
You know what? That's a really, I think you just hit the nail on the head. I thank you. You you need to go become a therapist. You just therapized the therapist. Yeah, that's exactly what it is that I didn't get those needs met growing up. And to be able to provide that for my children, it's like, oh my God, my life has come full circle. Like nothing feels better
Mm.
than that to me. So yeah.
I love that for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, personal question for you.
Sure.
With all the work that you're doing to help others, what is it that you want people to know most?
I want people to know most how to be emotionally supportive. Period. There's just an absolute dearth of that in our world. We are walking around just so emotionally wounded and unsupportive to each other and ourselves. And I think if we, it's like, there's this push toward physical health and in putting healthier foods in our bodies, and I want to see emotional health be as that level of priority.
That's a good one. Very good
Yeah,
one. All right.
thank you.
If there was one thing in particular that you want to be known for that would define your legacy, what would you want that to be?
Gosh, that's I had a good answer for you earlier. Now I've lost it. I think it's kind of related to what I just said, which is, just I want to be known for someone who uh, kind of helped open up the conversation around being emotionally supportive to each other. It's not, you're not going to, when I started on social media, you weren't seeing a lot of information. You were seeing a lot of information about how to protect yourself from a toxic partner, but you weren't seeing a lot of information about how to be more emotionally supportive to yourself and your partner. And that's kind of
Mhm.
where I want to go is bringing this, more to the forefront of the conversation, and not just with our partner, but with our children and all of our other loved ones. It seems like the narrative a lot of the time is how do I protect myself? How do I protect myself? How do I protect myself? And I want to move us out of how do I protect to how do I connect?
That's a trade line almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if that's
And
your
and
goal,
I just to put this out there, I'm not, I don't, there's a lot of other people that are sending this message too. So I guess I'd like to be lumped in with the category of people, starting in 2010 who started really talking about this whole connection thing in a new, bigger, broader way.
well, I think if that's your goal and that's what you're looking for, anyone who listens to this episode would probably agree that you're already there. So,
Well, I hope so. Thank you. Definitely the goal.
all right, last question. If you could use your platform to educate anyone who may be struggling with security in their relationship or their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
Honestly, I mean, I hate to be self-promoting, but I would start with my book, Secure Love, because that's really what I try to answer that very question in the, I spent a book trying to answer that question, which is just starting with kind of, hey, in the first few chapters, I'm just going to help you explain what went wrong, like why you're having these struggles to begin with. Like, most likely you grew up in this home where you didn't really get your emotional needs met. And, some people are going to show up with that, with this more of an anxious attachment. And some people are going to have more of an avoidant attachment. And most people are going to fit into a category, but some people don't. But hey, let's just try to help you understand yourself and what went wrong. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the book kind of walking you through the process in a self-help way of how to remedy that in your relationship, how to start doing things new from what you grew up with. And so, yeah, I would honestly, that's where I would start. I'm biased, but
There's nothing wrong
there's
with
a book
that.
out there too, just maybe to put another resource out there. There's another book out there called Hold Me Tight by Sue Johnson. And she really does a great job. She created the type of work I do. She's far more brilliant than I am, or she's passed away now, but she talks also about negative cycles and helps people understand what is going on underneath. You really need, the first step is really understanding what's actually happening in these repeated patterns of fighting and disconnection.
Mhm.
So anybody who's
Okay.
good at explaining that from an attachment theory, I'd say that's your starting point.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being so vulnerable and open about your own experiences. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to do this with you. And
Oh, you're so
if
welcome. Thank you.
anyone wanted to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
Yeah, so my website is called thesecurerelationship.com, and I have, you can get help anywhere from just, an hour-long course to on attachment theory. I have a really great shame workshop that I did and I turned into a course. A lot of us know what shame is and we know how it's getting in our way, but this is like a 2-hour actual step-by-step healing journey that I think is very, very helpful to people who are struggling with shame. And then from that, I've got my book, and then I've got also therapists who work for me who do the type of work that I do, that I train. And then my social media is where you'll find thousands, hundreds, I don't know, at least 1,000 free posts. A lot of times I'll go into great detail, 10 pages of detailed information about this work and how to bring it into your relationship. And that's all free. That's my way of giving back to the world. And that's called The Secure Relationship, the account.
And then where can people find your books?
Anywhere books are sold. Secure Love, Amazon. We've got lots of different languages. And so, yeah, just know Secure Love anywhere.
Gotcha.
Bookstores, yeah.
All right. Well, Julie, I want to again say thank you for this. Thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for your time. Thank you for who you are. And thank you for how you do it.
Oh, you're so welcome. Well, thanks for having me. It's been great.